The obstructions against David's title by the insurrectionist organizations who have infiltrated the United States government loyal to the Separatist Confederacy for the white supremacist communism have generated obstructions to David's projected contract schedule, acknowledged by them in the secret records as the primary motive, as it is the justification of David's estimated status, which would have asserted him as the aristocracy, leading to his arrest as the patriarchy, which then facilitates the normalization of the trade as those seeking the position of the Senate from the separatists uh, understood that David as the aristocracy would have barred them from their position, including their development of the Confederate policies that they would have been acquiring their position from voter fraud through, and thus the mechanism of having to remove him from that advantage, and thus the back and forth jigsaw puzzle would have required them to have established David as the member of the military and thus the intelligence oversight at the six-star general ranking of actively participating of his position with Congress, having been dedicated to national security, became the primary strategy as long as they have to deal with the function of his status, which cannot by law be changed except by due process of law, and thus no one can be made guilty by the government of anything, and thus no one can be subject to be labeled an enemy combatant by the United States government except for due process by law. And thus, barring these actions, they sought to use the intelligence functions in order to launder their fraudulent narratives, which, having hyper been invested in the function of the war on terror, has been refined to their various forms of perfection, and thus the exchange of defrauding the court structures and Congress and other systems have engaged in the normalization of this position, and thus Congress having pretended sovereign immunity in order to protect it in the action of conducting the function strictly prohibited by Congress from the separatist position have acknowledged David's status for the express purpose of illegally purging it of its substance, requiring the obligations of its restoration or a duty to order reconstruction of the title contract schedule for the payments and etc. to have been redistributed to their correct positions and to not tolerate the war of attrition of the communists for the white supremacy who have engaged in these criminal operations for that express purpose. And thus, the definition of receiver has to be qualified. A receiver is an indifferent person between the parties appointed the court to collect and receive the rents, issues, profits, lands, or products, personal estates, or other things which does not seem reasonable to the court that either party should do, or where a party is incompetent to do so, as the case of an infant, the remedy of the appointed of a receiver is one of the very oldest of the court chancery and the founded of the independence of the remedy to obtain the court of ordinary jurisdiction bisque q, and thus the action of the receiver being the primary strategy of that function by one of the insurgents to compromise the primary data, as David's estimated contract schedule is reliant heavily on data itself, and thus the action of undermining it, and thus acquiring a double agent to infiltrate the systems to become its receiver would then manipulate the function of David's advantage of having classified materials that the intelligence community would not legally have access to give them access by virtue of the double agent, and thus the compromising of the system by the undermining of the contract schedules policies of the companies that David would have had and would have matured under his education, which was obstructed from the School of Hard Knocks to be banned ex post facto by Lindsey Graham's Confederacy for its white supremacist communism, asserting that the compromised by the communism inside of the education structure would be able to bar the accreditation of the boarding school and thus the action of removing it in its entirety for the purging of the essential pieces of information leading to David's informed educated reports on the issue for his grades, and thus the position of the receiver insurgents would then limit the receiver of the burghers' arrangement to their grades and not David's grades, and thus the action of their inherent inferiority, which is the reason why they needed to escalate into the conflict as a retaliation for having lost the grades by comparison, and thus the limitation of David to them becomes an inherent defect of the criminal communism by their arranged Soviets of their KKK contractors for the KKK surveillance operations for the enforcement of the Confederacy as its preferred militia, as it pretending a private sector function would not have the limitations of the government, and its not being official acts having been hyper promoted, such as, but is not limited to, by Edward Snowden, who preferred individual targeting over mass collection, includes the function of the malicious subversions and damages by the terrorism, creating criminal injuries to property in order to coerce parties into uh, escaping to other means similar to the functions of Netanyahu's position of conducting the war against the Palestinians and stating that they have the choice to leave or to be bombed and killed, and thus the action of them leaving or dying makes it a willful leaving under that fraudulent policy, which is in fact not willful leaving, but the act of being coerced into it, and thus the action of having disqualified the concept of willful, as the act against the will is not their act, as the function of the damage is designed to make the party relent on the issue as it is pulled from them, and thus the action is in perpetuity the function of the criminal operations for their hate crimes, as many of them have subcontracted the Israelis to assist these terrorist operations, and thus these procedures having actively been incorporated into their complicated pseudo-intellectual positions materializes the function of their criminal arguments, which, having been barred from any legal court, has actively disqualified itself from being official acts, as they are allergic to the function of the official act obligations, and thus having been disqualified once they are actually engaged in the function of a legitimate function of the government and not the unofficial functions, and thus the action of them being individuals without a legal government is the status quo operations when operating in William Barr's pre-crime operations in the distribution of their black market contracts for the profiting off of the criminal market by those structures similar to the function of the Iran-Contra operations, which having been brought into the civilian population has then from William Barr's arguments, not just being qualified for the function of the program, but the individual's arbitrary profits, and thus, if they can do it for the profits of the program, then they can profit off of it as individuals, and thus he ignores the distinction between them because he is not an American, and thus the function of the Confederacy in its Wizard Council operations have muddied the distinguishment, and thus the action of the DOJ and others, having been hyper compromised, give fraudulent legal theories in their advising of the presidency, which would expand the function of the criminal operations permitted to the presidency in the undermining of checks and balances for the purpose of eradicating national security for the Confederacy as a parasite. Erto, therefore, we all must die horrible deaths according to the Satanic ritual abuses and its sacrifices. And to this extent, the receiver, if any, would have to have been contracted separate to the function with layers of security. Beyond this, according to the estimate, having to catch up to the original value from that position, and thus the arrangement having not been limited by their inferiority, including the function of the obstruction against David's education, which is essential to the function of the maturing of the actual policy, has to be restored, and thus the actions has to have security checkpoints of disconnected functions to guarantee impartiality, as they, being separate insurance functions, would be fully liable to acquire the value by the receiver to engage in the function of it being filtered into the normalization of it being certifiable to the legal history of its obstructed value, and thus the expansion back into the free market, and thus the targeting of David in order to remove him as a premier economic aspect of the system would have changed the function of many trades in the economy throughout the entire system, subsequently changing the economy so that they could break down the order in its absence of its stable order. And thus the arrangement requires the full in-depth study of the entire market, which, being a Herculean task, requires David to take the world away from Atlas, that he, as Hercules, might hold it for the extended duration of that time until the education is caught up and the policies have settled under these series of checkpoints, which would be necessary to have stopped the function and thus the action of the classified actions beyond the intelligence agencies, which would have actively sought insurgents, including the function of the normal actions of the intelligence communities, which compels the functions of biometrics in order to compromise people individually for nerve hacking, engaging in the immediate access of the information, which is an extension of the function that they do not need to have spies as long as they have uh, photocopy repairmen, and thus the actions of being able to have their own copy or to tap the data, and thus the action of it being compromised is a threat to national security by the Confederate threat to the nation, and thus the action of their insurrectionist war criminals engaging in the perpetuity of their conflicts to overthrow these United States by their systemic application of insurrectionist treason through the application of consistently applied malicious seditions, which, by definition, bar David's office from the enforcement of the law, which, in the absence thereof, qualifies the progress of their criminal policies, which are well aware of the American policies that they would have done, which they actively seek to act stupid, including the function of intentionally intending to forget about them for the express purpose of progressing the Confederate agenda, and thus the action of their liability is intentional and thus directly malicious. And to this extent, these expansions require the function of the United States to correct against it, including the prosecution and full sentencing under the redacted policies that were blocked by their voter fraud, and thus not allow the Confederate advancements, and thus must return to the American system, which is an actively changing system in a highly complicated arrangement, which comes back to Atlas and the world, by which Hercules must take the burden, and to this extent, it being outrageous in its foundation to its pretext, is designed to be outrageously burdensome to the point of exhaustion, and thus breaking by the encumbrance, and to this extent, the extensions would have to be necessary and expansive in order to have certified the reapplication of the foundation of David's economic exchanges for the full reconstruction of the building, that the structure of David's faculties might accept the burden of the world, that it in that action might remain stable, which requires the security functions in their entirety by the in-depth study of its historic positions, such as, but is not limited to, the intelligence oversight function of David's department, according to their theory, which would have asserted that David would have been a part of the Deep South historically, which would have facilitated the protection against many of the black parties, which would have been slaves, in order to have developed the education of the system, which those who, having received these burdens, would have received the hyper-educational position, advancing the multiple PhD developments of these systems of security from a historic position to the modern day, and to that extent, the mechanism of it having been undermined from these decades long, exponentially highly researched positions from these extraordinary minds being an outrageous burden to reacquire, becomes unreasonable fundamentally, and thus must be adaptive inherently, that it might, as scaffolding, be reconstructed upon examination, and thus the lack of Maxim's commitment, which would have been normalized in the strategy of the receiver, might be undermined, and thus national security must be preserved by the non-commitment, and thus the action of the commitment to the complexity takes precedent, which requires the investigation of the various ways that it could have played out, and to engage in the function of the higher likelihood functions without the pollution by the terrorists, and thus the action of it normalizing into likelihood histories, and thus the action of likelihood progresses, which established a tech tree which might go in one direction or an entirely different one, which could be reviewed infinitum to be appealed and thus reapplied in a more legitimate manner upon further examination. These duplicitous complications include, but are not limited to, the functional theory that David would have designed his own nation, and thus the action of a constitutional kingdom, which they did not want to have to respect, under the fraudulent argument that they were not supposed to respect a title of nobility, which is not relevant amongst American officials, and thus the action of it being a title of nobility asserts itself in the obligation to have created its own separate entity, and thus the action of the title of nobility is not relevant according to that argument, and thus the action of the reference of the title of nobility when they were seeking the barring of David's national news to stop the reporting of reality in their contempt for it, for the sales and distributions of their fraudulent illusions, generates the assumption of the Confederate action, which is just as viable a theory, that the Confederates' position of the assertion of nobility is the establishment of the title of nobility that they were seeking, whereas David is stronger than they are in their own estimated structure inherently, and thus the action of his superiority in power in comparison to these degenerates facilitates their desire of a title of nobility, which then becomes a weakness, which they then would have abandoned, and thus the potential of the thing separates into its nullification, as their objective searching for this title of nobility for themselves becomes compromised by David's possession of its superior possession in that arrangement, and thus requires the answer that while they do not have an opposition to the title of nobility, they just don't want David to be in their nobility, as David, being presumed according to the Chinese as not being corruptible, would not betray the United States, and thus would fundamentally be the enemy of its adversaries, such as the Confederate separatists engaging in this insurrection, which they, having actively sought to peel away the authority of Congress, would immediately be crushed to unrepairable separation, as David's superiority to them would reassert the potency of Congress against their contempt for Congress, which has extended historically to the position of their contempt for the courts and to any other opposition or potential challenger to the Confederates, and thus the action of any rival to the idea of slavery without cause is their immortal foe, and thus their obligation inherently to declare war on it as their mortal enemies, generating a Mortal Kombat! Do 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 do. Jingo. The criminal enforcement of terrorism, censorship, and other strictly prohibited functions as an automated activity engages in the function of a bill of attainder and ex post facto, which, having been strictly prohibited by those specifically cited, are the ones co-signed by the ones specifically cited, requiring their purged nature from the system to be fulfilled as purged, unless the action of disqualifying the insurrectionists by those mechanisms facilitates the normalization of law against the white supremacy and its communism. And to this end, you have the mechanism of its perpetuity, separation of associations, if the victims do not acquire the power under the fraudulent use of malice in the subversion of withholding of documents against those who are qualified to have possessed them, materializes the threat to national security and its active application of the insurgent terrorism which the United States military was supposed to destroy, and thus the action of George W. Bush's order stating that all terrorists or those who support terrorists are enemies of the United States is law, and thus the action of having already labeled them as traitors to the United States according to the legal definition provided in the dictionary facilitates the obligation to enforce the act of treason and those who supported the functions in the intelligence operations for these white supremacist contracts, and thus the contractor of the receivership must actively subvert those plots, and thus the action of its complications must inherently be understood in those separated checkpoints, materializing the position of the capacity to subvert the direct insurgent advantages, while the function of the intelligence can be put into its proper place, such as the recreation of David's next computers, which would be capable of barring the intelligence community from it, and thus bar them from the classified materials that they do not have a right to, which is lawfully Congress's possession under David's Department of Intelligence Oversight as its top-ranked general, and the barring of associations in combination with the criminal intent to collapse David's status by exhaustion against the law facilitates the terrorist operations, which, having barred the information from the courts of records is the application of unofficial actions by terrorist insurgents without a legal government, and thus the actions of them having compromised the offices is the assertion of their unofficial act to be treacherous in nature. And to this extent, the purpose to undermine the law which they are no longer serving facilitates the obligation to certify them according to their insurrection as their violent obligation to overthrow the authority and kill the king, lest that they be retaliated against and that the law crush them as the central power, and thus their collective insurgency by voter fraud creates a fake majority which would be arrested and punished to the fullest extent of the law for threatening national security, which they have sold to America's enemies, which includes the devils they worship and other perceived adversaries, to potentially create threats such as the cell of opportunity to make invasions, similar to how the United States was created in its entirety, and thus the purchase of the right of expansion to be not interfered with by other countries being sold as the payment for their acts of treason, and thus to this extent the function of this having been hyper-accelerated includes the barring of the freedom of associations, threatening the associations to not recognize the obstructed association for the rewriting of history, and thus the winner writes the history books, and thus the loser is forgotten in the genocide, and thus the complete destruction of the sexuality and reproduction and posterity is inherent to their nature as genocidal degenerate freaks. And to this extent, David and many of the others would have to acquire the position that the Confederates feared at the higher levels in order to have defeated them, in order to correct the associations. And while he would not inherently need those positions in order to have gained those associations, he does need them in order to protect those associations from his adversaries who endanger the lives of all men, women, and children, specifically the ones threatening their threat to national security. These terrorist operations have to be understood as non-dischargeable uh, liabilities as their criminal operations, which would have actively been incorporated according to their own theories to have facilitated this corporation of the federal government's operations in their sedition, and thus the action of it being David's department, and thus the action of it being a federal debt under the dischargeable action for their criminal operations as individuals without a legal government materializes the function of their obligations to pay, which reintroduces itself for the full investigation to be conducted, including the multiple facet operations of discovery of the specific structure theories, which would be put into its artistic functions according to the original estimate, which requires the creation of movies, TV, and other artistic functions in order to express the inherent potential theories until one solidifies from the coagulation into a material belief structure by the collective imagination and thus materializes into the contract schedules theory of the collective network's interests from the individual definitions materializing into the collective ideal for the subconscious cognitive theories for this into its structural normalization, which requires the high investment into those extremely expensive operations, which then would materialize into the expansions for the arts, such as the music functions, and to this extent, these high expansions would be materializing the distribution of the original owed liabilities for the Confederates and others, and thus the action of it materializing into the receivership under the structures of those dispersed values materializes the checkpoints of the recreation of the zombie insurance and its protocols, and thus the action of the reconstruction of the entirety of these subjects being an essential function of any reconstruction, qualifying anyone who would attempt to become a receiver, defining an impartial receivership, which being ignored by those criminal intentions who engaged in the bill of attainder for the purpose of not paying those contract schedules for the eradication of the status without due process according to those secret record operations materializes the function of their treachery as an insurrectionist, disqualifying them from office and thus the action of their acts of treason of using their position as a weapon of war to engage against the legal government according to their own conscience and understanding, and thus the action of its obscuring, and thus materializes as the obscuration into the function of it not being able to be reconstructed, and thus undermine the procedure of the government as they have actively conducted sedition. The obstruction of the function of the government until it ceases to be is the thing that they sold, such as, but it's not limited to, the theory from the secret record of the Chinese, who would have bought the right to make military operations and invasions, such as through the immigration tactics, where they would conduct replacements of the population through the wizard communism to assert the breaking down of the order until those Americans would have been collapsed with the lack of the security under that sale for the distribution of it as a conquered people, which would then reinforce the opposition of the Americans, who, no longer having a functioning government to protect them, would be fully conquered in the property of whoever would have bought the right of invasion. Thus, the materialization of the deal with the devil, according to the devil's religion, materializes the devil's strategy of consistently seeking the material separation of parties from their securities, which has to be the guilt of the victim, and thus the intended target has to make themselves vulnerable to the situation for the spell to work, which is systematically being arranged for, and thus the arrangement of the rape culture requiring the humiliation tactics of those who would have been preferred is then validated in that obscuring from the security with the certification of the participants not taking the injury from the terrorism in order to avoid the preference in favor of the rapist, who then materializes the function of that rapes as a status quo norm in the unsecured precedent, and thus the action of the parties vulnerability and perpetuity would not be understood until the trap had been fully met, and thus the action of its complete collapse, which includes the function of its various solutions and retaliations of credible, viable threats, which requires the function of the zombie insurance to diversify, in that example, the sexual options by the protocols of the zombie insurance, to diversify the sexual options of the victims until they could be reunited at the appropriate time due to the inconveniences arranged by the rapist who, seeking the application of the permission, would be denied in that action by counter complication that can be resolved at a later date if they follow the procedures and checkpoints of that arrangement of union and disunion, and according to these arrangements would have to have been certified in its appropriate settings, certifying the connection of those original estimated associations, qualifying the exception to the rules, which qualifies the trading of the partners in the emergency by their rapists and the threats of the rapists, which qualifies the function of the distractions as the function of someone who would be important, such as the president's wife, would actively be threatened in order to get compliance by the president is a state of emergency, and thus the action of the security alternative facilitates the ability to protect the president's wife and thus protect the president from compromising the position in the distressed state. And this and many other examples qualify these types of distractions, which would have to naturally be dealt with, and the ever evolving situation of the insurgency and the counterinsurgency is a arms race escalation which materializes the function of the ever obligation to increase in the data collection and materialization and stabilization, which has been the foundation of their censorship operations, as their adversaries being censored does not cost them as much to compete intellectually as the disqualifying of the chess mass is their strategy to maintain the position, and thus the malicious harassments and terrorisms, such as their poisons and brain injuries derived by their radio signal surveillance and other Redolin-based poisons and others would have materialized the function of the distressed state of the other party, who would then make some ridiculous mistake giving them an advantage, and thus the action of these complications are inherently degenerating, as the action of having tolerated them, including the function of their ability to restrain the parties, creates permanent damages in the absence of any functioning government to repel these criminal motives, which rely on the rapist's ability to change sexual market values, which, having control over the charts as an insider, materializes the ability to fraud the record until it collapses into the legitimacy where they no longer have to do anything legitimate in order to sustain the higher value, materializing the communism